Good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends. Good afternoon or good morning, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from. We did open this up virtually, and we have a number of people joining us online. I guess the disadvantage of offering online on a rainy day is that we have fewer people physically in the room, but don't worry, we are quite high-level panel of legal experts and consultative network for their work defending journalists and free expression around the world. Additionally, I want to thank our esteemed panelists for your participation. We look forward to learning from your experience. We are joined both in person and online by panelists as well. And finally, a big thank you to our co-sponsors from the missions of Austria, Denmark, Lithuania, the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and the United Kingdom for your support, and of course for everyone joining us today in person and online. Esteemed colleagues, every day the Human Rights Council works to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As the Council has reaffirmed time and time again, core to these efforts is the protection and promotion of media freedom, which is critical to uncovering corruption, holding governments accountable, combating disinformation, and informing the public. Yet in discussions with journalists and media actors around the world, we hear growing concerns about a technology known as commercial spyware that threatens journalists and their sources in ways we have never seen before. This technology is being used to remotely target devices in order to access users' calls, photos, videos, and data, often without the user having any idea that their device has been breached. Targeted journalists with whom we have spoken described their terror in realizing they themselves or their sources may be in danger, including those for whom anonymity is often a matter of life or death. They have discussed the feeling of violation as they grapple with the fact that personal information, such as sensitive medical procedures, photos of their children, or their locations, are now being tracked. They have relayed to us how ostracized they felt when their colleagues and sources fear any contact with them. Even journalists who have not been targeted are feeling the repercussions. Their fear of becoming targeted has become one more reason that they must second-guess their safety and therefore self-censor. There is now a growing industry selling this technology, which is being used to abuse human rights, and yet there are too few regulations and guardrails governing it. That is why the United States, along with a growing coalition of 20 countries so far, is dedicated to tackling its proliferation and misuse. And we call on all member and observer states of the Human Rights Council to join us in taking action. I would now like to turn to our panelists and members of the U.S. government joining us today. First of all, from the U.S., we have Maher Bitar, Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Defense and Intelligence Policy at the White House. He is joining us, unfortunately, by virtual remarks. Things are very busy at the White House, as you can imagine. So we do have, thankfully, Deputy Assistant Secretary from the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Allison Peters, who will remain online with us and to answer any questions that you might have from Washington. So before we play the video, just want to remind folks that you won't be able to hear the audio without using your ear cuffs. So with that, we will play the tape of Maher's remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all for gathering today to discuss this pressing issue. My name is Maher Bitar, Coordinator for Intelligence and Defense Policy on the National Security Council at the White House. I want to first highlight Ambassador Taylor's emphasis on the impact that the misuse of this technology is having on individuals on the front lines of the fight for human rights. Journalists who have been targeted by commercial spyware just for doing their jobs, and dissidents who are targeted for exercising their basic rights to speak out and challenge power. Today, we have the privilege to learn directly from journalists and human rights experts so we can take action. Over the last 3 years, I'm proud to say the United States government has taken a leadership role in taking action. It has been a significant undertaking that has required close engagement across our entire government. Throughout this process, we have centered the human impact misuse of these sophisticated tools can have. The team that we have working on this, which includes U.S. personnel from multiple departments and agencies, is inspired in large part by a strong desire to protect journalists and media freedoms. We have engaged over the past 3 years with numerous targets of commercial spyware misuse, and their stories are potent reminders about the human cost of commercial spyware proliferation. Keeping in mind the complexities involved with bringing together various government entities to address the threat, I'm here today to discuss how the U.S. has approached this issue. Our efforts began in the wake of revelations in 2021 of extensive misuse of commercial spyware to target human rights defenders, journalists, and politicians around the world. Mobilizing our government was not easy at the outset. The misuse of commercial spyware poses both human rights and counterintelligence and security concerns for the U.S. government. And I have no doubt, as human rights experts, you see this in your own work every day, that national security, respect for our norms-based international system, and protection of human rights are all intrinsically tied together. To address this, the White House has led a government-wide effort that has brought together members of our government working on counterintelligence, national security, human rights, and emerging technologies. We recognize that many governments have real security concerns and use these technologies to perform legitimate law enforcement and intelligence missions under strict legal and policy constraints. At the same time, these tools are easily abused and can pose reputational risks for governments without sufficient due diligence. The U.S. government therefore pursued a three-pronged approach that we hope the governments present today will replicate and build on. One prong has been to regulate our own government. In 2023, President Biden signed an executive order that places restrictions for the first time on the U.S. government's own use of this technology. Another prong has been an intense diplomatic push to engage like-minded partners on this issue. We launched the Joint Statement on Efforts to Counter the Proliferation and Misuse of Commercial Spyware in March 2023 at the Summit for Democracy. This coalition of governments dedicated to this effort has now grown to 21 members, with many here today even co-sponsoring this event. We're working to grow this coalition even further. The third prong of our approach has been to implement accountability measures and impose costs on problematic spyware vendors and abusive users. This began with a critical push from our Department of Commerce to leverage our export controls and add commercial spyware vendors to the entity list in November of 2021. The U.S. Treasury Department is also leveraging its sanctions regime, and at this point, they have imposed financial sanctions on 6 entities and 7 individuals in this industry. This year, we added an additional accountability tool with new visa restrictions. Critically, this policy applies both to individuals who misuse commercial spyware and individuals who financially benefit from the misuse of commercial spyware. These measures have sent a strong message to the commercial spyware industry and to investors that the U.S. government will take action against companies involved in proliferating and enabling the misuse of such tools. Taking these 3 prongs together, we are already seeing the impact that coordinated action can have. Additional action by the international community has the potential to multiply these impacts. Between our efforts and those of other partners like the UK and France with their leadership of the Pall Mall process, we see a promising path forward to continue making headway on protecting journalists and media freedoms from the threat of commercial spyware misuse. As members of the Human Rights Council, we have the unique opportunity to lead in this effort. That includes putting in place policies and guardrails to ensure our own governments are using these technologies responsibly and sourcing from responsible companies. It also includes leveraging our accountability tools to hold misusers and the vendors that enable them accountable. And finally, it includes taking action at the Human Rights Council. I am heartened to see language focused on the threat of commercial spyware included in the tabled Internet Freedom Resolution language and hope to see continued attention to this issue. Thank you.
In absence, thank you to Deputy Assistant to the President, Bitar. As you heard, this is a very large priority for the White House, for the entirety of the U.S. government, and we're grateful to all of our partners. We'll now turn to our other panelists who can come to us with a wealth of expertise and even personal experience with being targeted. I'm going to pose two questions to each of you to guide today's conversation. The first one is, what effects are we seeing on journalism from commercial spyware misuse? And what are steps that governments can take to address the misuse of spyware against journalists? I'll first turn to Catherine Amirfar, Deputy Chair of the Media Freedom Coalition's high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. Catherine, given your work drafting the Media Freedom Coalition's white paper on commercial spyware misuse and journalism, I thought it was appropriate to begin with you. The floor is yours.
Ambassador, thank you very much. It's really a privilege and a pleasure. I'm only sorry I can't be in the room with you. I also want to thank the co-hosts and the sponsors of today's event. It's absolutely critical for all of the reasons and the excellent table setting that's already been laid out. In my time, I just wanted to focus on what the high-level panel has been doing with respect to this issue. So the high-level panel is an independent advisory body to the 51 countries that comprise the Media Freedom Coalition. It's comprised of 15 experts from across the world with different aspects of expertise when it comes to legal issues intersecting with media freedom. And we're charged with providing that independent legal advice to states that are part of the Media Freedom Coalition. And part of that mandate, of course, is to follow very closely challenges to media freedom. And in the last couple of years, we cannot, as the panel, imagine a more important issue, a more important challenge that requires a priority view and sponsorship by member states than the cyber targeting of journalists. You've already heard about the intimidation, harassment, assassination of independent journalists around the world. It has reached crisis levels. You're going to hear some stories today on that front. And it is a fact that commercially available spyware is facilitating this trend. It's enabling the targeting. It's enabling the silencing of journalists. Many in the room will be familiar with Pegasus, which has been documented to have affected hundreds of journalists in 21 countries. But that, unfortunately, is the tip of the iceberg. It's not just Pegasus, it's Predator, it's other newly available technologies that are proliferating. So I want to focus on just 4 impacts and then pivot to your second question, Ambassador, in terms of what can be done. There's 4 impacts. The first is killing the story. And killing the story is so much about, for journalists, that spyware being used to threaten the confidentiality of sources, to harass the journalists, to track them and their sources and intimidate them into silence. It undermines the ability of journalists to build those relationships with sources, with whistleblowers, to carry out their independent reporting, and creates an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship. The second is that it feeds the violence. At worst, spyware is deployed as a tool to assist in attacks and murders of journalists. And I think the case of Khashoggi is the most widely known and most widely understood, but again, tip of the iceberg in terms of how this spyware, with a zero-click technology, does not require reporters to do a single thing. It infects their cell phones, and the cell phones turn into ability and facilitating their targeting. The third I want to point to is disproportionate impact. These tools are used disproportionately against women who face highly sexualized harassment intended to intimidate and silence them online. And there's numerous incidents, documented incidents of female journalists facing that kind of harassment. UNESCO's 2020 global survey showed that 3 out of 4 respondents of female journalists said that they experienced online violence. That's a staggering figure that gives you a sense of the scope of the problem. And finally, with the proliferation is the financial impact. Commercially available spyware is very easily obtainable. It's prolific in its abuse. It imposes a financial burden on journalists and the media, requiring them to keep up. And there's only a few labs in the world that have the sophistication, the technological sophistication to meet these threats. Citizen Lab, Amnesty International Security Lab, and Access Now's Digital Security Helpline. So not enough resources out there. So let me pivot very quickly to what can be done. We have been working as the high-level panel in consultation with the executive group of states and the consultative network of civil society organizations to develop a set of recommendations for states on what, immediate actions they can take up to counter the misuse of commercial spyware. I think we'll talk about this more, but the recommendations seek to build on the efforts to date to commit to the use of commercial spyware only within strict bounds, to ensure that their use does not violate human rights, norms of international law, to ensure that states are supporting and expanding on existing offerings by civil society, and to regulate private companies on their use and sale of commercial spyware. That would include levying sanctions where credible information exists supporting involvement in abuse. And I'll just mention that the United States has shown some real leadership that we at the high-level panel have taken advantage of. As you heard from Deputy Assistant Patar, there's been 21 states that have joined the joint statement, which is very much about setting up robust guardrails and procedures. And just a couple of weeks ago, on the Media Freedom Coalition's 5th anniversary, Austria, Estonia, Lithuania, and the Netherlands joined. So it is a start. It's not enough, but part of this is galvanizing action. And I'll leave it there and happy to turn back to some of these themes. But thank you again for having me.
So a few years ago, before Morocco normalized relations with Israel, and it's important to give some context because that's what unleashed a lot of suppression of press freedom in Morocco. It was discovered that a young journalist in Morocco, Omar Radi, and I encourage everybody to look into Omar's ordeal in Morocco, because he was the first case that was the tip of the iceberg and then showed how much Morocco was using the Israeli spyware Pegasus. So Omar's phone was diagnosed by Amnesty International and Citizen Lab, and they found Pegasus. Morocco, of course, denied for many things. Morocco doesn't really care when they're accused of spying on journalists because they've been doing that for so many years. But before a diplomatic agreement with Israel, they were not even allowed to use these kinds of spywares or make these kinds of economic dealings with Israel. So when Omar's phone was diagnosed with Pegasus, Morocco decided to charge him with sexual assault and rape, and he was put in prison in order to cover up a little bit this what had happened. And then we discovered in the months that followed that Morocco had actually targeted thousands of numbers, not just journalists. So that had huge implications in the months that followed. And what happens in Morocco now is that most journalists are targeted. Most journalists can't speak to their sources, can't report. It's just been really devastating for our ability to work. I'm not in Morocco all year, but I know that people are aware that journalists are targeted, activists, any kinds of voice that's critical of the government. And as a result, people don't want to exchange. We are scared also for our sources. We never know. I get my phone checked, but I actually don't know for a fact if it's infected or not, because there could always be a new spyware that's been created that those who can check my phone don't know about. So we always live in this kind of state where we don't know. So we just assume we are targeted. We just assume that we can't really use our phones for any kind of sensitive and sometimes not even sensitive, just meeting with a source or just asking them very mundane questions. We don't know because we don't want to put them in a situation where their phones are also targeted, where their privacy is also targeted, where they're at risk. During Omar Radi's trial, it was very clear that his phone was read by the authorities. They were reading directly from his phone. One of the cases they built was that he was a spy for multiple countries, and they used, for example, text messages between him and diplomats to where he was telling them things like, oh, maybe I'm available for coffee or things like that. But the fact that they were reading from his phone at his trial was extremely disturbing. And a lot of organizations like Citizen Lab, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Committee to Protect Journalists, have put together extremely comprehensive and detailed reports on this. And I invite you all to look at these detailed reports per countries. And it's not just Morocco, it's Egypt, it's Jordan, it's Palestine, it's so many countries in the region where peace activists, human rights activists, journalists were targeted, and politicians and so on. I'll take questions. I'm better at answering questions than just going on and on. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Aida. And I think especially important to remind us that not only can these technologies be placed on your phone without any action on your part, but also that they are so often undetectable or only detectable through, very, very high-tech forensics. Next, we will hear from Szabolcs Panyi, an investigative journalist and V-Square and Direct 36, another journalist who, I believe this time it's correct, was actually targeted by commercial spyware. Szabolcs?
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I'll be very brief describing the situation in Hungary. So I was one of those journalists who was targeted with the Pegasus spyware, but I was also a member of the so-called Pegasus project, which uncovered abuses with this tool back in 2021. What we discovered is that the government of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán deployed this spyware against a handful of journalists. We identified at least 6 or 7 journalists and reporters and photojournalists who were targeted with Pegasus, and at least 3 media company owners, businessmen who owned media that was critical of Viktor Orbán's government. We also discovered that at least a dozen lawyers were targeted. So it's not just the confidentiality of journalist sources that was infringed, but also client attorney privilege. Hungary is already under a so-called rule of law, a conditionality mechanism, and there are numerous very credible and heavy criticism coming from EU institutions that the rule of law in Hungary is not working. And the whole Pegasus spyware surveillance is just really the tip of the iceberg. What we discovered is that basically, for example, in my case, the spyware was running for 7 months on my phone while I was working on numerous stories, mostly about Russian influence in Hungary. And in a very ironic fashion, it was not the Russian authorities, but the Hungarian authorities who spied on me. Hungary was the very first country from the European Union where credible reports about abuses with the Pegasus spyware came to light. Then it was followed up by Poland and Spain. And while I see it as a great achievement that the United States has been sanctioning the developers and the distributors of spywares, I would also encourage not just the US, but other governments as well, to also call out, name and shame the abusers, the operators of Pegasus or Predator, the spyware that was deployed in Greece, to call out those governments and those government officials who are responsible for abusing these tools, and of course, potentially put them also under sanctions, because I believe this is the only thing that would have the proper deterrence effect. Last but not least, I would also like to emphasize that Europe is in a relatively better position compared to, of course, North Africa or the Middle East. But we should not be complacent, because we already see that the spyware surveillance in any country is just the first step in a path towards harassing journalists, jailing journalists, or even using violence against journalists. So I would really like to encourage everyone to also call out the abusers, even if they are NATO and EU allies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Szabolcs. That everyone around journalists can also be targeted, that it becomes this insidious web, and also for giving us some concrete suggestions about what we can do to push back. Next, we have Natalia Krapiva, Senior Tech Legal Counsel at Access Now, who has been one of the lead advocates in this space and who also works directly with individuals targeted by commercial spyware at Access Now. Natalia, turning to you, our first in-person speaker.
Yes, thank you. Access Now and partners have been exposing the use of spyware against journalists around the world, from El Salvador to Jordan to right here in Europe. Our investigations show that spyware poses an urgent threat to journalists as it invades their privacy, undermines confidentiality of their sources, chills their reporting, and threatens their physical safety. Last year, we uncovered the targeting of the phones of 5 Armenian media workers with Pegasus spyware, 2 Radio Free Europe journalists, Karlen Aslanyan and Ashtrik Bedivian, a co-founder of Arm News, Samvel Farmanyan, and 2 other anonymous media workers. We suspect that these individuals were targeted by the government of Azerbaijan in the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh war with Armenia. This year, we also found 6 prominent Russian-speaking and Belarusian independent journalists targeted with Pegasus. Galina Timchenko, the head of Misuse, Maria Epifanova, director of Novaya Gazeta Europe, Evgeny Pavlov and Evgeny Erlich, formerly with Current Times Media, Natalia Radzina, the founder of Charter 97, and 1 anonymous Russian journalist. Most are living in exile in Latvia and Lithuania, and many were targeted, we think intentionally, while they attended human rights or media freedom conferences in Riga, Vilnius, and Berlin. We suspect that there is likely an EU government responsible for these attacks. All these journalists are already operating under extreme conditions in the context of war, political crisis, exile, and transnational repression. Having their phones hacked with Pegasus spyware that allows the attacker full access to their digital life further endangers them, their colleagues, their sources, and their loved ones. For example, Ashtrik Bedivian told me that one of her main concerns that her hacked device contained information about her children. Galina Timchenko also shared that the Pegasus attack against her made her fear for her physical safety and for the safety of her contacts, sources, and colleagues. Despite these harms, none of the states that we identified as potential perpetrators have taken any visible steps to investigate these attacks. Democracies have a responsibility to ensure that spyware tools do not get into the hands of dictators, but also to refrain from using these tools against the very same people that these dictators persecute. We applaud the United States for sanctioning individuals and companies like NSO Group, Candy.ru, Sandvine, Intellexa, and for prohibiting its own agencies from using their tools. Democracies should not be doing business with spyware companies that undermine the rule of law and human rights. We recommend that countries adopt their own similar measures and coordinate sanctions internationally. States should also adopt legislation to ensure that their own agencies do not target journalists with spyware. And if any abuses do occur, there should be accountability and access to remedy for all victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for, first of all the work that you are doing at Access Now, and also for, again, giving us some real concrete action that states can take. Finally, I would like to turn the floor to Tim Engelhardt, a human rights officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, one of the first UN bodies to tackle the issue of commercial spyware misuse head-on in its 2022 report on the right to privacy. Tim, over to you, and thank you for that report.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for the invitation, for organizing this event, and thank you also to the co-sponsors. The previous speakers have already painted a very dark picture how spyware impacts journalists, human rights defenders, dissidents, artists, and I can only echo this. We as an office have raised the alarm about spyware and more broadly the proliferation of cyber intrusion capabilities for years. And the word has been uttered before we face a crisis, a human rights crisis here. It requires urgent action. Ambassador, you have already, in your introductory remark, pointed out how spyware really, the intrusion into personal devices really affects everything. It means that there's access to information about every aspect of the life of that person and their entire networks. And for journalists, that's catastrophic. I would like to quote a victim here, which encapsulates the situation quite well, many of the aspects that have already been raised. The devastation I felt after discovering that the security agents who had tortured me had successfully hacked my phone and violated my privacy was overwhelming. I spent countless sleepless nights fearing the potential harm to those who had entrusted me with their sensitive information. In the report you have already mentioned, we highlighted manifold aspects, manifold impacts of spyware abuse. To put it in human rights terms, we're speaking here about serious interferences with the right to privacy, possibly also freedom of thought and opinion. Victims report deep trauma affecting their mental health. Spyware has been reported as contributing to arbitrary arrests, times leading to torture or extrajudicial killings. And the chilling effect on freedom of expression has already been mentioned too. The Supreme Court of India, in a ruling linked to the Pegasus spyware, described the chilling effect of such surveillance as an assault on the vital public watchdog role of the press. We also have to think about due process and fair trial when it comes to evidence forgery, and of course the security and privacy implications for millions of users if we keep vulnerabilities in our systems. So what can be done? It's not easy. The High Commissioner, Special Rapporteurs, states, technical experts, civil society organizations have repeatedly called for a moratorium on the use, acquisition, and trade of spyware unless it's ensured that adequate, strong human rights safeguards are in place. To achieve that, action is needed domestically and at the regional and international level. We have heard already some promising examples. And the action really needs to address both states as actors and businesses. States need to build safeguards built on the human rights principles of legality, lawfulness, legitimate aim, necessity and proportionality, transparency. We need clear, precise, publicly available legal frameworks that includes banning and criminalization of abusive practices, and if there's governments see a need for legitimate uses, there need to be very, very strong limitations in place, limited to very serious circumstances such as crimes against life. That can't be a routine measure, and measures taken against journalists should be just not permitted. Prior judicial authorization is another aspect. Independent oversight. Procurement rules need to be addressed. Acquisition should only be allowed from companies that can show respect for human rights. If the human rights track record is bad, we have good examples in the US in this regard, they should not be able to enter the market. Public debate is essential. Various parliamentary debates, investigations, etc., are good examples. The regulation of businesses as high-risk technologies in this area is essential. Expert controls, regulating market access, etc., requiring human rights due diligence in a systematic way. I would also really emphasize the need to strengthen accountability and access to remedy. Criminal investigations, prosecutions are essential. Removing barriers to litigation for victims would be a very important step. Thinking here, for example, of barriers they face when it comes to the doctrine of foreign state immunity, even when litigating with businesses. Transparency is key, and that addresses states here as well. Notifications of targets must be possible once investigations cannot be put at peril by that. Transparency reporting should be in place. Then international norm building that is underway. I'm very, very happy to see the efforts that have gotten some traction. The joint statement has been mentioned, the Pall Mall process. And they indicated very welcome growing awareness and willingness to tackle the problem. And we would be very happy to support and point to areas where we could possibly have improvements and enhancement of the scope. And finally, I would also like to emphasize that we need better capabilities to monitor the use of spyware, the reporting, building up the defense capabilities of journalists and others, as has been mentioned before. What's in place is being done by extremely capable, extremely committed organizations and researchers, but they do it on a shoestring, and there needs to be much more that can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you brought up two important things that we hadn't talked about before, and one of them is the importance of being proactive and not just reactive. And so we really appreciate, again, the report that came out, as you said, before it's a crisis. And then, of course, normalizing the terminology, but also having these discussions. The more that we talk about it, the more we understand what we mean, the better equipped we are as an international community to come together and work on these issues. So thank you so much for that. I think many folks joining us today also bring their own expertise and knowledge. So I'd like to open up the floor for discussion. I think we have probably about 10 minutes for that, and we'll start first with the UK's Ambassador Sanders.
But I didn't even need to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle, and to your US colleagues for convening the session today, and to all of the panelists for your very interesting remarks. Thank you also, I should say, to OHCHR for having this on your agenda from a very early stage, and as you've just outlined, for telling us how you've been focusing on this and raising it up the agenda, which we think is really important. I too would like to acknowledge the really critical work being carried out by media workers, journalists, civil society actors and human rights defenders who often work day in, day out in dangerous circumstances, also in cyberspace, as we've just highlighted. As you have all explained, there has been a growing focus on how we can make progress towards tackling irresponsible and malicious behaviour across the market for spyware and broader cyber intrusion technologies. We, as the UK, are proud to have played our part in these discussions. Deputy Assistant Bitar mentioned the Pall Mall process, so it's probably apposite that I say a little word about that. The Pall Mall process is an initiative that we, the UK and France, initiated with a range of other countries, but also commercial entities and non-government organisations, essentially to establish a framework for responsible activity across the market, in line with a set of principles that we set out in the so-called Pall Mall Declaration earlier this year. Essentially, the idea is that we will incorporate international outreach, best practice and information sharing, develop voluntary guiding principles for all of these actors, and align cyber proliferation with broader international cyber activity. So we see this very much as something that is not just about spyware, but spyware, of course, is a big part of that. And it's really important that we have this kind of activity to reach across government, non-government, and commercial spheres. So in that spirit, I would put a question to the panelists sort of along those lines, which is, at the international level that we're operating in here today, how can we optimise that interaction between governments, many of us here represent governments, and the private sector to make sure we're all pulling in the right direction going forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for your insights and question. I'll turn next to Sylvia from the Center for Technology and Democracy, who is joining us online, and then maybe we'll turn to the panelists to answer and then take a couple more questions.
Hi, yes, my name is Silvia Lorenzo Perez, and I'm the Director of the Security and Surveillance and Human Rights Program at CDT Europe, an organization based in Brussels that advocates for the promotion of democracy and human rights in European tech law and policy. I would like to start by saying that modern spyware, as you all know for sure, is not just another tool at the service of law enforcement. It is a total paradigm shift. It doesn't just violate individual privacy, but it shakes the very foundations of our democratic values and violates every principle on which the European Union is built. It creates considerable national security risk, compromising the security of sensitive government information and undermines digital sovereignty. The harms are so severe that we must even question whether traditional safeguards are even fit to avoid the disproportionate impact on individual human rights. However, the reaction of EU leaders has not matched the severity of this threat. Since the adoption of the recommendations of the PEGA Committee of the European Parliament, the European institutions, have failed to take effective measures to address the widespread misuse of spyware. And arguably, the situation has even worsened after the adoption of the European Media Freedom Act, which you might be familiar with, adopted this year and introducing grounds and the framework to deploy spyware such as Pegasus and Predator against journalists. The European Union has the highest standards on privacy and data protection in the world, but yet it has remained impassive in the face of the appalling revelations and scandals plaguing the European Union. So this lack of action is what has led CDT Europe to spearhead the creation of a civil society coalition that advocates for transparency, accountability, and respect for fundamental rights in relation to spyware technologies. Our coalition is made up by 16 organizations from all over the European Union, coming together with the objective of combining our efforts, expertise, and resources to join our voices in sending a very firm message to the European policymakers. We will not continue to accept a regulatory vacuum in the European Union that exposes citizens to serious harms to their fundamental rights with total impunity. Following the EU elections that took place in June this year, members of the coalition released a joint statement calling incoming EU policymakers to prioritize action against spyware in the European Union during the next legislative term. Our statement was supported by over 30 organizations from all over the world, in calling specifically for the adoption of a new EU legal framework that addresses the challenges posed by spyware, which should include an EU-wide ban on highly intrusive spyware that disproportionately interferes with fundamental rights and for which no safeguards would ever be sufficient to prevent and redress harms to fundamental rights. We also call member states to take active steps towards outlawing commercial spyware developed by private companies and to exercise restraint in their interpretation of national security needs. In this regard, CDT Europe welcomes the US government's strong political resolve in leading the fight against spyware vendors and rallying global support to develop and implement policies that combat misuses of commercial spyware. The fact that many EU member states have signed the statement reflects the growing recognition of the need for regulatory solutions within the region. Therefore, we urge the US to seize this opportunity to intensify its diplomatic engagement with the EU institutions to secure active commitments from the European Commission, Parliament, and Council. This can begin now and should continue throughout the next year when an extraordinary opportunity will pertain. Starting in January, Poland will assume the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. As a signatory of both the US joint statement and the Palmal Declaration, Poland stands out as one of the very few EU countries actively investigating and seeking accountability for the misuses of spyware nationally. This creates a pivotal opportunity to advance action on spyware within the European Union. So we urge the US administration to engage in diplomatic dialogue with the Polish government in order to advance policy and political commitments against spyware in the European Union during Poland's presidency of the Council of the European Union. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the organizing of this very important event.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think in the interest of time, if they can do it very quickly, I see 2 placards up. If you could maybe ask your questions, and then we'll let all of the panelists incorporate questions into sort of a rapid fire wrap up. So we'll start with the ROK, please.
Pastor, first of all, I'd like to thank the United States delegation for convening stateside event on this very important issue, and also thank the panelists for their stories and insights. We believe commercial spyware poses a serious danger not only to the national security, but also to the rights of our citizens, and to the pillars of our democracy, as one of the panelists already said, including freedom of media and journalists. If left without appropriate measures, this market will continue to grow rapidly and uncontrollably. So in order to respond effectively to this matter, we believe building partnerships among multi-stakeholders, sharing information and experiences on the threats and tools to identify and address the misuse of commercial spyware are very important. In this vein, I would like to ask the panelists on how the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms can further contribute in raising awareness and setting appropriate measures that are guided by human rights and fundamental freedom. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And then EPLO will take your last question.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor, for organizing this event. An open discussion on this matter is welcome and necessary. I have 2 questions. The one has to do with detection. We have a rapidly advancing technology. Some of the previous speakers said that we don't know whether somebody is spying on us or not. Can somebody tell us what the state of play is on this issue? The second one has to do with tangible results. The Undersecretary mentioned that sanctions and other, are there any court cases? Are there any cases that have been pursued actively? Mr. Engelhardt talked about criminal investigation. And what exactly has the impact of sanctions been? Thank you.
Great, thank you for those questions. I think I'll just ask each of the panelists to incorporate maybe answering those questions where appropriate into a few final words. So we will go, I guess, in the same order. Maybe start with Catherine.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for the comments and questions. So I think I will weave them in. One of the first questions was how we can optimize the intersection with the private sector. I think both in terms of the intersection with the private sector and some of the other actions that are necessary. The first, and I would say absolutely minimum necessary step, is for states to marshal the political will to commit to actually addressing the crisis. Now, of course, spyware technology sits at the intersection of national security and human rights. And sometimes that intersection results in inertia, inaction, complacency. But the urgency of the situation can tolerate complacency no more. And I think this is why the steps taken by the U.S. and the 20 other states, for example, by signing up the joint statement, is both laudable and necessary. But again, that's a first step. The second step is the concrete action, and the concrete action that we know demonstrably work. Financial sanctions, I mentioned, are effective. Visa restrictions are demonstrably effective. And it's that kind of concrete action that matches the words in the joint statement, and including regulation of the private sector, is what sends the message out. And in responding to some of the questions, there have been myriad lawsuits, for example, against NSO Group, the sanctions against NSO Group. There's a track record here, a playbook, if you will, of what governments can do, what these kinds of lawsuits can do from bringing accountability to the table. The other aspect of concrete action I'll mention is the commitment of resources. This has been mentioned. This also dovetails with the question on detection. Detection, attribution of these kinds of sophisticated technologies is very resource intensive. It requires highly specialized technical knowledge, and there's not enough out there. There's not enough access now, resources devoted to organizations like Access Now, like Citizen Lab, who are there and one of the few that are there for journalists to actually help them react to this kind of threat. So I think taking a step back to mitigate this threat, states need to build on both words and actions, working within coalitions of the committed, such as the Media Freedom Coalition, such as the Freedom Online Coalition, in tandem with civil society, in tandem with journalists, to end the harmful impacts. And again, to respond to another question, the Human Rights Council is a very important part of shedding light on this important problem. I'll end with saying that the high-level panel is currently finalizing a set of recommendations to be shared with MFC members, and we hope that these member states and everyone in the room will lead the way in these efforts. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Aida?
I don't have much to add to what Catherine says. I think she gave a really thorough and excellent answer to all of this. I would just encourage supporting groups that are paying attention to this, that are helping this. As journalists, I usually go to Citizen Lab, and they're a fantastic organization. And I would say just empower them and give them more resources.
Thank you. Sabolch, some final words?
So I would just like to reiterate my previous point that that not forgetting about the abusers, who they are, and calling them out, I think it's extremely important. And I see that my colleague from Greece, Thanasis Koukakis, is here among the participants. For example, the Greek government should receive more criticism for how it spied on its own citizens, journalists, and also the opposition. So I think just keeping the issue in the spotlight, and this panel has been very important in that regard, is extremely important to the victims and also to prevent journalists from becoming future victims of surveillance. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalia?
Sir, a couple of questions at the same time. So on working with companies, what states can do, and on detection, I would say that organizations like Citizen Lab are currently one of the most really advanced organizations, researchers who understand the spyware and the newest version of spyware and how to detect them. But there's definitely, we're always one step behind, and there's new types of technologies are being developed. And so we need actually help from tech companies, the platforms on which this spyware is actually targeting. So we need to encourage measures like preventative measures, like Apple has a lockdown mode that is very effective right now, and also to notify their users when they see that things are happening on their infrastructure, to send those notifications that Apple sends already, threat notifications. We encourage more companies to do those kind of notifications. And on the litigation, I just want to add, there's already, as was said, a few lawsuits, but there is definitely a challenge with jurisdiction. We find that, for example, a victim can come from one country, living in exile in another country, traveling at the time when they were hacked with Pegasus or other spyware in a third country, and then the country that's responsible for that is some fourth country. So as you can imagine, there's a really big challenge with filing those cases, finding jurisdiction. So we do encourage states not wait until victims actually file cases, but proactively, when there is a credible allegation and research, actually initiate those investigations proactively. Thank you.
Tim, over to you.
Yes, it's always difficult to be the last because you all have covered so much ground, and there's, I think, not that much to add. So just a couple of points. On criminal investigations, indeed, I'm aware of several. Poland has been mentioned before. In Germany, actually, the investigations led to the closure of one company, which filed for bankruptcy at some point as an effect. So these measures work. I think the takeaway here should really be, it's a serious problem. It requires serious responses with a lot of political will and the willingness to spend political capital. The Human Rights Council and its mechanism can do a lot, and in fact have already have their influence. I would highlight especially special procedures, the various rapporteurs, and most notably the former Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression with a very extensive report on spyware in 2019, I think it was published. Then one point that's inherently linked to it is cybersecurity, having an approach to cybersecurity that centers human rights and individuals. For example, it makes little sense to undermine encryption at the same time being concerned about intrusive surveillance measures. Strengthening cybersecurity is key. And finally, center the victims in the discussions, in responses. We need to think how to better protect them and how to give them access to remedy if they're actually being targeted. Thank you and good afternoon.
I think we have about 1 minute left. I wanted to invite Allison Peters, who's with us from Washington, to share any comments or if you have any answers to any of the questions you'd like to share.
So much, Ambassador Taylor, and just really wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to so many of our incredible speakers and those joining us in the room. I think what we have heard today is this is a global problem that requires global solutions. I think the speakers have highlighted a number of different mechanisms that we have in place, from accountability measures to putting in place safeguards in our national laws and regulations, to supporting the digital security of civil society and journalists that are directly impacted and beyond. And so instead of going through each and every question, I do want to sort of end on a call to action that we are here standing in partnership with many of the governments in the room. As noted in the outset by Mahar Bhattar, we have continued to build a global coalition to tackle this threat and put in place safeguards inside our own government to deal with this threat. And we look forward to working with each of you to share our best practices and experiences and stand in strong solidarity with the journalists on this line and beyond in support of media freedom. So again, just a huge thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to remaining in touch as members of the Human Rights Council to tackle this really critical threat to media freedom.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here, to our panelists today. I know that our time has been limited, but I certainly hope that this discussion is just the beginning of a much longer conversation about this issue here at the Human Rights Council in particular. And my team and I look forward to remaining closely coordinated with all of you on this issue moving forward. Thank you so much.